Hello, and welcome to our chapter by chapter devotional through the entire Bible. Today we're going to be in Genesis chapter 9. Genesis chapter 9. What I do in these devotionals is I give you a quick summary of what happened in each chapter and then point out maybe some spiritual implications or spiritual truths for you to consider. So as we come into Genesis 9, the flood has ended. Noah and his family have exited the ark, and the first thing we see after Noah exits the ark, he makes a sacrifice. Then in Genesis chapter 9, we see that God pronounces a divine blessing upon Noah and essentially upon mankind, because that's always God's desire. God's desire is to bless instead of curse, to give good things rather than to judge. And we see that in Genesis 9 verse 1. It says, God blessed Noah and his sons, and he said to them, be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth. The same blessing that was originally given to Adam and Eve. After this, we do see that the world has changed. And in regard to those changes that have taken place, there are some new provisions. And one of those new provisions is that mankind will now also have in his diet meat. He will now eat meat products, not only fruits and vegetables. And we see that in Genesis 9 verse 3. God says, every moving thing that lives shall be food for you. And as I gave you the green plants, now I give you everything. So God has changed the standard for man. So while it's perfectly okay to choose to be a vegetarian, there's also nothing sinful or immoral about being a person who eats meat, because God has simply adjusted his commands to the world that we live in today. And in addition to that, there's also, to make for a better world in the future, there's some new mandated punishments and some mandated protections from God regarding human life. Here's what it says in Genesis 9 verses 5 and 6. And for your lifeblood I will require a reckoning. From every beast I will require, and from man. From his fellow man I will require a reckoning for the life of man. Whoever sheds the blood of man, by man shall his blood be shed, for God made man in his own image. Now, if you remember, one of the problems and one of the reasons for the flood to begin with is that violence was on the earth everywhere. People were killing people. So God establishes capital punishment as one way to deter and to limit that violence. And so let's remember that God calls us to honor human life, and where human life is not honored, he calls for capital punishment. And because man is made in the image of God, and therefore man's life is special, it's different than animal life. Where we're allowed to take animal life, we are not allowed to take unjustly human life. After this, God gives a comforting promise. It says in Genesis 9 verse 11, God is speaking. He says, I establish my covenant with you, that never again shall all flesh be cut off by the waters of the flood, and never again shall there be a flood to destroy the whole earth. And God said, this is a sign of the covenant that I make between me and you and every living creature that is with you, and for all future generations. I have set my bow, talking about the rainbow, in the clouds, and it shall be a sign of the covenant between me and the earth. I would imagine that was very comforting for the people who came after the flood, because they would have known relatively recently the flood, and every time it started to rain, they probably would have feared that another flood was coming. So God wants to comfort people and know that there is safety, that God is not going to judge in that way again. And then we see that even though the world has changed and there's been this judgment, there's still the problem of sin. There's still the issue of immorality in man's heart, and we see that in two examples. One, Noah gets drunk, and as a result of his drunkenness, he ends up exposed, naked. And Ham, one of his sons, who's named Ham, exposes his sin, shows him disrespect, is basically mean toward him instead of covering over his sin. We see that in Genesis 9 verse 20. It says, Noah began to be a man of the soil, and he planted a vineyard. He drank of the wine and became drunk and lay uncovered, that is, naked, in his tent. And Ham, the father of Canaan, saw the nakedness of his father and told his two brothers outside. Then Shem and Japheth, Noah's other sons, took a garment, laid it on both their shoulders, and walked backward and covered the nakedness of their father. Their faces were turned backward, and they did not see their father's nakedness. So we see in two different reactions. Whereas Ham exposed Noah's sin, and was disrespectful and shameful in his behavior. The other two sons, Shem and Japheth, they were doing all they could to cover Noah's sinfulness. And as a result of that, at the end of the chapter, we see that Ham is cursed. He comes under judgment, whereas righteous Shem and righteous Japheth are rewarded and blessed for their righteousness. So it's a lot to consider in this passage. I hope that you will reflect upon it and think about what the implications may be for our own life. That God's blessing still exists for us, that he's given us even more comforting promises than he gave to Noah about escaping judgment in the future, and that you and I should be righteous and not try to expose people's sins, and not get any kind of perverse enjoyment out of that, but rather we should be those who try to bring a covering when people have failed and when they have sinned, like righteous Shem and Japheth did. I hope you will consider these things. Have a blessed day.